A battle-scarred military K9 with one eye and a reputation for aggression, abandoned by everyone who'd promised to save him. A female ranger with nightmares from her last deployment and a cabin that echoed with too much silence. Neither was looking for redemption, but in the mountains of Montana, broken souls sometimes recognize each other in ways no one else can understand. This is the story of a dog nobody wanted, and the woman who saw beyond his scars to the warrior still fighting to trust again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The windshield wipers fought against the relentless Montana. Snow creating a hypnotic rhythm that matched the dull ache in Sergeant Morgan Reeves's chest. She'd been driving for nearly 3 hours from her remote cabin in the Bitterroot National Forest, her forestry service truck handling the treacherous mountain roads with practiced ease. The dashboard clock read 2:17 p.m., though the heavy grey clouds made it feel much later. Morgan hadn't planned this trip. In fact, she'd closed off her schedule for the entire week, telling her supervisor she needed time to prepare for the coming fire season. It wasn't entirely a lie. She did need to check her equipment and review the updated protocols. But the truth was simpler and more difficult to explain. Next week marked 1 year since her medical discharge from the Army Rangers after the IED that had killed 3 members of her unit and left her with a titanium rod in her leg and nightmares that medication couldn't touch. The emergency note she'd left on her office door this morning wasn't exactly accurate, but the emptiness that had greeted her at dawn, the same emptiness that had been her only companion for months, had finally become unbearable. Something needed to change. Morgan's knuckles were white against the steering wheel as she pulled into the parking lot of Last Chance Animal Rescue. The facility sat on the outskirts of Missoula, its weathered buildings and chain-link runs a stark contrast to the majestic mountains surrounding the city. The snow was falling harder now, accumulating on her windshield faster than the wipers could clear it. She sat motionless in the truck, watching her breath form small clouds in the cold air. Her reflection stared back at her from the rearview mirror, sharp cheekbones, dark circles under eyes that had once been described as her best feature, and a jagged scar that ran from her right temple to her jaw. The military-precise bun that held her auburn hair felt too tight suddenly, another reminder of a life she was trying to leave behind. What was she doing here? She wasn't a dog person. Her life as a ranger hadn't allowed for pets, and her current job as a wilderness ranger meant long days patrolling remote areas of the national forest. A dog would just be another responsibility. Another life depending on her when she could barely trust herself to make it through each day. And yet, here she was. The heavy door of the shelter swung open with a protesting creak as Morgan stepped inside, bringing with her the smell of pine and snow and the particular solitude that clings to people who spend too much time alone in wild places. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh against walls painted an institutional shade of beige that had faded to something closer to resignation. A young man looked up from the reception desk, his smile automatic but genuine. His name tag read Ethan, and his eyes held the particular brightness of someone who believed in the work they were doing. "Welcome to Last Chance. Are you looking to adopt today?" His enthusiasm seemed to bounce off Morgan's stoic expression and retreat slightly. Morgan cleared her throat, suddenly aware that she hadn't spoken aloud to another human in 3 days. "I'm looking for a dog." Her voice came out rougher than intended, military precise in its economy of words. "Great. We have so many wonderful dogs who need homes. Any particular breed or size you're interested in? We've got some amazing lab mixes that just came in, super friendly and already house-trained. Or if you're looking for something smaller, the one nobody wants," Morgan interrupted, her words falling like stones between them. Ethan's cheerful expression faltered. "I'm sorry?" "Whatever dog has been here the longest, the one you can't place." Morgan's gaze remained steady, challenging him to deflect or offer platitudes. Ethan studied her for a long moment, taking in the rigid posture, the slight favoring of her right leg, the weathered Forest Service uniform that couldn't quite hide the military bearing. His eyes lingered briefly on the scar along her face before dropping to the counter between them. "That would be Ranger," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "But he's not actually available for—" "Ranger!" Morgan interrupted again, something sharp twisting in her chest at the coincidence. Ethan nodded. "Belgian Malinois, former military working dog. He's been here 8 months, but he's classified as unadoptable. He's got issues." Morgan felt something shift inside her, a recognition that felt uncomfortably like looking in a mirror. "Show me." Ethan hesitated, glancing toward a door marked "Staff Only." "Ma'am, I should really get Kelly. She's our behavioral specialist, and the only one who handles Ranger." "Then get Kelly," Morgan replied, her tone making it clear this wasn't a request to be deflected. While Ethan disappeared through the staff door, Morgan remained standing, too restless to take a seat among the optimistic posters of successfully adopted pets that lined the walls. Each image showed smiling families with their new companions, joyful tableaus that seemed to belong to a different reality than the one she inhabited. The door reopened to admit a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her movements were efficient and purposeful as she approached, her eyes assessing Morgan with professional interest. "I'm Kelly Winters, behavioral specialist," she introduced herself, offering a hand that Morgan shook briefly. "Ethan says you're interested in Ranger." "Yes. May I ask why?" "We have many dogs better suited for companionship or—" "I'm not looking for a companion," Morgan cut in, her patience wearing thin. "I'm looking for a dog that needs a place. That's all." Kelly's expression shifted, professional curiosity, giving way to something more cautious. "Ranger isn't a typical shelter case. He was deployed with a Special Forces unit in Afghanistan. His handler was killed in action, and Ranger sustained significant injuries. He lost his right eye, and he's got shrapnel scars across most of his body. The military deemed him unsuitable for continued service or civilian adoption." Morgan's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. "He was transferred from base to base for nearly a year before he came to us," Kelly continued. "He's shown extreme aggression toward male handlers and unpredictable behavior in enclosed spaces. He's bitten 3 different staff members who attempted standard handling procedures." "So why haven't you euthanized him?" Morgan asked bluntly, recognizing the unspoken conclusion of Kelly's assessment. Kelly's expression revealed nothing, but her pause spoke volumes. "Because on his good days, I can still see the dog he used to be, and because his file says he saved 4 soldiers by detecting an IED that would have killed them all if they'd continued down their planned route." She studied Morgan's face. "But that doesn't make him a pet, Miss—" "Reeves, Sergeant Morgan Reeves, former Army Ranger, current Forest Service Wilderness Ranger." Something flickered in Kelly's eyes, recognition, perhaps, or reassessment. She nodded slowly. "Follow me, Sergeant Reeves." They moved through a series of hallways, passing kennels where dogs pressed hopefully against chain-link doors, tails wagging at the prospect of attention. The cacophony of barks and whines created a backdrop of animal desperation and hope that made Morgan's skin feel too tight. Kelly led her past the main adoption floor to a separate wing marked Special Rehabilitation. "This section is for cases requiring specialized care or behavior modification," Kelly explained as they walked. "Most will eventually transition to the adoption floor, but some—" She didn't finish the thought as they reached the last kennel in the corridor. Unlike the others they'd passed, This one had solid walls on 3 sides, with only the front featuring heavy-duty chain link. A red sign posted prominently on the door read, "Caution, staff only, no direct contact." Inside, a large Belgian Malinois lay motionless in the back corner, his tan and black coat dull under the fluorescent lights. His right eye socket was covered by a mass of scar tissue, and similar scars crisscrossed his muscular body in patterns that told stories of violence and survival. His remaining eye, amber and intense, fixed immediately on the newcomers, tracking their movements with military precision. Morgan felt her breath catch. There was no tail wag, no hopeful shift in posture, just the absolute focus of a soldier assessing potential threats. She recognized the alertness, the coiled tension of a body prepared to move from stillness to action in a heartbeat. It was the same readiness she still carried in her own muscles, even a year after leaving combat behind. "This is Ranger," Kelly said quietly. "As you can see, he doesn't welcome visitors." Ranger's gaze shifted from Kelly to Morgan, and something changed in his posture. A subtle reassessment that Morgan might have missed if she hadn't been trained to notice such details. The dog's head tilted slightly, his single eye narrowing as he studied her. "His file says he was part of a bomb detection unit," Kelly continued. "Elite training, multiple deployments. After his injuries and his handler's death, he couldn't adjust to new handlers. The military tried for nearly 6 months before classifying him as unserviceable." Morgan kept her eyes on Ranger as Kelly spoke, maintaining the kind of steady, direct eye contact that acknowledged the dog as a being worthy of respect rather than an object of pity. "What happens to him now?" Kelly sighed, the sound heavy, with the weight of difficult decisions. "Officially, he's here for rehabilitation assessment. Realistically, we're running out of options and space. The board meets next month to review special cases, and Rangers will be among them." The implication was clear. Morgan understood institutional euphemisms too well. She'd written enough reports that translated deaths into casualties and described trauma in terms of operational impact. "I'll take him," she said, the decision crystallizing with unexpected clarity. Kelly's professional composure fractured momentarily, surprise overtaking her practiced neutral expression. "Ms. Reeves, Sergeant, I don't think you understand. Ranger isn't a candidate for standard adoption. He needs specialized handling, constant management, and likely will never be safe around other people. This isn't like taking home one of the labs from the front kennels." "I understand exactly what he is," Morgan replied, her voice steady, "and I'm not looking for a standard adoption. Do you have experience with military working dogs or aggression cases?" Kelly pressed. "No, but I have experience with soldiers who can't come home all the way." Morgan's eyes never left Ranger, who remained motionless in his corner, watching them with unnerving intensity. "I have 20 acres in the mountains, no neighbors for miles. I patrol the forest alone most days. He won't be a danger to anyone but me, and that's my choice to make." Kelly studied her for a long moment. "We would need you to sign liability waivers absolving the shelter of responsibility, and I would insist on a trial period with check-ins before finalizing anything." "Fine," Morgan agreed. "When can I take him?" "Not today," Kelly said firmly. "I need to prepare him for transition, and you need to prepare your property, secure fencing, appropriate containment areas, proper equipment. I'll give you a list. Earliest would be next week, assuming you can get everything in order." Morgan nodded, accepting the terms with the same efficiency she'd accepted mission parameters in her previous life. Her eyes returned to Ranger, who had shifted positions slightly, his head now raised as if reassessing the situation. "Does he respond to commands?" she asked. Basic ones sometimes, but inconsistently. His trigger responses are unpredictable. Loud noises, sudden movements, men in certain types of clothing. Classic PTSD indicators. Kelly's clinical description carried an undercurrent of genuine concern. He's not a pet, Sergeant Reeves. He's a war veteran with serious trauma. So am I, Morgan replied simply. Kelly's expression softened almost imperceptibly. That's what I'm afraid of. They stood in silence for a moment, the fluorescent lights humming overhead as woman and dog regarded each other across the barrier of the kennel door. There was no Hollywood moment of connection, no sudden tail wag or whine of recognition, just two damaged warriors assessing and calculating. "I'll need your contact information," Kelly said finally, "and I'll put together that list of requirements before you leave today." As they turned to walk back toward the administrative area, Morgan glanced back one last time. Ranger had moved to the front of his kennel, his single eye still fixed on her retreating form, with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. There was no warmth in that gaze, no plea or welcome, just the wary assessment of a soldier who had learned that trust was often punished. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Morgan recognized that look. She saw it in her mirror every morning. The paperwork took nearly an hour. Liability forms, conditional adoption agreements, medical records, extensive, and behavioral incident reports, even more extensive. Kelly was thorough and unapologetic about detailing the worst-case scenarios. Morgan signed each form with the same steady hand she'd used to sign mission debriefs and medical waivers after her own injuries. "I'll call you with the supply list tomorrow," Kelly said, as she handed Morgan copies of the documents. "Take the week to really think about this, Sergeant. There's no shame in changing your mind." Morgan nodded, but said nothing. They both knew she wouldn't call to cancel. Outside, the snow had stopped, leaving the world muffled and transformed. Morgan sat in her truck for several long minutes, her hands resting on the steering wheel as she processed the weight of the commitment she'd just made. The cabin had been quiet before. Now it would contain another presence, another set of war, memories that manifested in ways she couldn't fully predict. What had she been thinking? She barely kept herself functional some days. How could she possibly take responsibility for a damaged military dog with aggression issues and PTSD? It was reckless, potentially dangerous, and definitely not the kind of decision her therapist would approve. And yet, as she started the engine and began the long drive back to her isolated cabin in the mountains, Morgan felt something she hadn't experienced in months: purpose. Not happiness exactly, or even hope. Those emotions seemed to belong to a different lifetime, but a sense that tomorrow contained something worth waking up for. The forest closed around her as she drove deeper into the wilderness. Massive pines heavy with snow creating a cathedral of winter silence. Somewhere behind her, in a concrete kennel with a red warning sign, a one-eyed dog with a warrior's scars waited. Not for love or for rescue, neither of them believed in such simple salvation anymore, but for the chance to find a new purpose in a world that had no place for what they had once been. Tomorrow, Morgan would begin preparing for his arrival. She would secure her property, research equipment, create safe spaces and barriers. She would approach this like the mission it was: methodical, strategic, with contingency plans for all potential failure points. But tonight, as her cabin came into view, a solid structure of timber and stone, standing defiant against the wilderness, Morgan allowed herself to acknowledge the truth beneath her practical justifications. Some wounds never healed properly. In captivity, under fluorescent lights and well-meaning observation, some creatures needed space and silence to find their way back to themselves. She knew this because she was one of them. As she stepped from the truck into the biting cold of mountain twilight, Morgan looked up at the vast canopy of emerging stars. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the night ahead didn't stretch before her as an endurance test of memories and insomnia. Instead, it felt like preparation. The week passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Morgan approached the task of preparing for Ranger's arrival with the same methodical precision she had once applied to mission readiness. Each day began. Before dawn, her usual nightmares giving way to purposeful wakefulness as she worked to transform her property into a suitable environment for a traumatized military dog. The list Kelly had sent was extensive, bordering on intimidating. Heavy-duty containment kennel, specialized equipment, including a tactical harness and muzzle, reinforced fencing for a secure outdoor area, visual barriers to prevent territorial reactions, and enough medical supplies to stock a small veterinary clinic. Morgan had winced at the total cost, but transferred the funds without hesitation. Money wasn't an issue. Her military disability payments and forest service salary accumulated steadily in her account, with nothing but basic necessities to spend it on in her isolated existence. The physical labor was harder. Her leg protested. The constant movement, the titanium rod, a persistent reminder of her limitations as she dug fence post holes in the half-frozen ground and assembled the prefabricated kennel in her heated workshop. Each evening found her soaking in a hot bath with prescribed pain medication, grimly acknowledging that recovery wasn't a straight line, but a jagged path of progress and setbacks. By Thursday, she had completed the essential modifications to her property. The large workshop adjacent to her cabin now contained a separate section with the reinforced kennel, spacious enough to give Ranger room to move, but secure enough to contain him if he became aggressive. A fenced run extended from the workshop into a clearing among the pines, giving him access to outdoor space without the risk of escape. Inside the cabin, Morgan had created what Kelly called a decompression room, a spare bedroom stripped of all non-essential items with a protective covering on the floor and a single dog bed positioned to allow its occupant clear sightlines to all entry points. On Friday morning, Morgan made the long drive back to Last Chance Animal Rescue, her truck now equipped with a special transport crate secured in the bed, covered with a tarp to provide the darkness and security Kelly had recommended for the journey. The nervousness she felt was unfamiliar, not the sharp-edged adrenaline of pre-mission briefings, but something more complex. Was she really equipped to handle this? Was she making a mistake that would end badly for both her and Ranger? Kelly was waiting when she arrived, her expression a careful neutral that gave away nothing about her thoughts on Morgan's return. "You came back," she observed, leading Morgan to a small conference room rather than directly to Ranger. "I said I would," Morgan replied simply, easing herself into a chair and trying not to reveal the discomfort in her leg after the long drive. "Many people have good intentions," Kelly said, arranging a folder of documents on the table between them. "Particularly when it comes to cases like Ranger. The reality is often more challenging than anticipated." Morgan said nothing, waiting for Kelly to reach her point. "I've been working with him daily to prepare for this transition," Kelly continued, "using techniques to desensitize him to the transport crate, introducing items with your scent, establishing a consistent pre-departure routine. But I need to be clear, he's still extremely unpredictable. This morning, he refused to take food from me, despite having accepted it yesterday. 2 steps forward, 1 step back is the best we can hope for with cases like his." "I understand," Morgan said, recognizing the warning for what it was. Not discouragement, but a final chance to reconsider. Kelly studied her for a moment, then seemed to reach a decision. I've prepared a detailed transition plan. The first 72 hours are critical. Minimal interaction, no expectations, absolute consistency and routine. He needs time to decompress and process the environmental change before you attempt any training or bonding activities. She pushed a thick binder across the table. Everything's in here. Daily schedules, feeding protocols, medication instructions, behavioral indicators to watch for, trigger management techniques, emergency contacts. I've also included my personal cell number. Day or night, if something happens, you call. Morgan accepted the binder, flipping through pages of meticulous notes and diagrams. It was more comprehensive than some of the mission briefings she'd received in the military. "Thank you," she said, recognizing the hours of work the document represented. "Don't thank me yet," Kelly replied. "This is where the real work begins." She stood and gestured toward the door. "He's been in the transition room since yesterday, getting used to the transport crate. Are you ready?" Morgan nodded, rising to follow Kelly through a series of hallways different from those they'd traversed during her first visit. They stopped outside a door marked Transition A, where Kelly paused to give final instructions. "Let me enter first. Stay by the door until I tell you otherwise. No sudden movements, no direct eye contact, no talking except as directed. Remember, he doesn't know you as a safe person yet. Everything about this situation is stressful for him." Inside, the room was dimly lit and sparsely furnished. In the center sat the large transport crate, its door open but secured so it couldn't swing shut unexpectedly. Inside the crate, Ranger lay with his back pressed against the far end, his body tense and alert despite his seemingly relaxed position. His single eye fixed immediately on them as they entered, tracking each movement with predatory focus. Kelly moved to the side of the room, her movements slow and deliberate. "Ranger, easy," she said in a calm, neutral tone that sounded well practiced. The dog's ear twitched in acknowledgement, but he remained motionless, his attention now fixed on Morgan. "Lower your gaze slightly," Kelly instructed quietly. "Stand sideways to him rather than facing directly. It's less confrontational." Morgan adjusted her position, angling her body and lowering her eyes to Ranger's chest rather than his face. The stance felt familiar. It was similar to techniques used when approaching potentially hostile civilians in combat zones, a way of presenting oneself as non-threatening while maintaining situational awareness. "Good," Kelly murmured. "Now very slowly, place the binder on the floor and take 3 steps back." Morgan complied, keeping her movements fluid and deliberate. As she stepped back, Ranger shifted position slightly, rising into a more alert posture, though remaining within the crate. The tension in the room was palpable, a silent negotiation of boundaries and intentions conducted without words. "I'm going to have you approach the crate now," Kelly said. "Stop when you're about 6 feet away. No eye contact. Keep your hands visible at your sides." Moving with careful precision, Morgan advanced to the indicated distance. From this position, she could see more details of Ranger's condition. The way his ribs showed slightly beneath his coat, the uneven healing of the scar tissue around his missing eye, the vigilant tension in muscles designed for speed and power. Despite his obvious physical compromises, he radiated dangerous capability. Kelly approached the crate from the opposite side, speaking to Ranger in the same even tone. "This is a transition day," she told him, as if he could understand the full meaning of her words. "New person, new place." She reached slowly into her pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a piece of dried meat, offering it toward the crate on an open palm. Ranger's nostrils flared, but he made no move toward the offering. His eye remained fixed on Morgan, assessing. "He may not accept food today," Kelly explained without looking away from him. "That's normal during transitions. We'll secure the crate for transport soon, but first I want him to hear your voice. Tell him your name, in a calm, even tone. Just that, nothing more." Morgan cleared her throat quietly. "Ranger, I'm Morgan," she said, keeping her voice steady and neutral, the same tone she'd used during operations when maintaining calm was essential. The dog's ear twitched again, registering the new voice. His eye narrowed slightly, but there was no growl, no visible increase in tension, just continued assessment. "Good," Kelly said. "Now we're going to secure the crate. I'll close the door while you stand completely still. Once it's locked, we can prepare for transport." The process of securing the crate, carrying it to the truck, and fastening it properly took nearly 40 minutes, with Kelly insisting on methodical care at each step. Morgan listened attentively to the detailed instructions about temperature regulation, stopping frequency, and signs of distress to watch for during the 3-hour journey back to her cabin. "Remember, absolute minimal interaction for the first 72 hours, Kelly reiterated as they completed the final preparations. "Let him adjust to the new surroundings at his own pace. Don't push for connection or training. Just establish the routine exactly as outlined in the binder." As Morgan climbed into the driver's seat, Kelly handed her a small bag. "His medication, the special food I've been using, and the training rewards that have worked most consistently. The emergency sedative is in a separate case with instructions. Use it only as an absolute last resort." Morgan accepted the bag, placing it carefully on the passenger seat. "Thank you," she said again, feeling the inadequacy of the words measured against Kelly's obvious commitment to Ranger's welfare. Kelly's expression softened slightly. "Call when you arrive so I know the transport went smoothly. And, Sergeant Reeves," she waited until Morgan met her gaze, "remember that progress isn't linear. Whatever happens, don't take it personally." The drive back to the mountains was tense, Morgan's attention divided between the winding forest roads and the precious cargo secured in her truck bed. She stopped twice as instructed, checking on Ranger without opening the crate, offering water through the specialized hatch but not attempting interaction. Each time, she found him in the same alert position, his eye tracking her movements with unrelenting focus. As she turned onto the final Forest Service road that led to her cabin, heavy clouds rolled in, bringing with them the season's first spring thunderstorm. Rain lashed against the windshield, and distant thunder rumbled across the mountains. Morgan tightened her grip on the steering wheel, concern rising with each flash of lightning. Kelly had warned her that loud noises could be triggering for Ranger, and a Montana thunderstorm in full fury certainly qualified. The cabin finally came into view, a solid silhouette against the darkening forest. Morgan pulled as close to the workshop entrance as possible, trying to minimize Ranger's exposure to the elements. The thunder was more frequent now, booming across the valley with increasing intensity. Following Kelly's detailed instructions, Morgan prepared the workshop space before attempting to move the crate. She set up the interior kennel with fresh water, laid out absorbent mats in case of accidents, adjusted the heaters to maintain the recommended temperature, and double-checked that all security measures were functional. Only when everything was ready did she return to the truck to begin the transfer. Rain pelted her as she carefully lowered the tailgate, soaking through her jacket within seconds. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the air just as she reached for the crate cover, and she heard a distinct low growl from within, the first vocalization Ranger had made in her presence. "Easy, Ranger," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the challenging conditions. "Almost there." The process of moving the heavy crate from the truck to the workshop was brutally difficult. Morgan's injured leg screamed in protest as she navigated the slick ground, the weight straining her arms and back. By the time she maneuvered the crate into position beside the prepared kennel, she was drenched, trembling with exertion and fighting to control her breathing through waves of pain. According to Kelly's instructions, the next step was critical: transferring Ranger from the transport crate to his permanent kennel, using a series of connecting barriers that prevented any possibility of escape. But as Morgan began to set up this system, her hands shaking from cold and fatigue, another thunderclap boomed directly overhead, so powerful it seemed to vibrate through the workshop's sturdy walls. From within the crate came a sound that froze Morgan's blood. Not a growl, but a high-pitched keening, followed by the frantic scrabble of claws against metal. She could hear Ranger's body slamming against the sides of the crate, his panic escalating with each thunderclap. This wasn't in the manual. Kelly had warned about possible anxiety during transport, but nothing in the detailed instructions covered a full-blown panic attack triggered by a severe thunderstorm. Morgan's mind raced through possible solutions, weighing the risks of each. Against Ranger's escalating distress, the emergency sedative was an option, but administering it would require opening the crate, a dangerous proposition with a panicking military dog. Waiting out the storm meant potentially hours of traumatic stress for an animal already pushed to his limits. Neither choice seemed acceptable. Morgan made a decision based not on the manual, but on instinct born from her own experiences. Moving deliberately despite her exhaustion, she lowered herself to sit on the floor beside the crate, positioning herself so she was leaning against it with her back to the side where Ranger was frantically moving. "Ranger, stand by," she said, using a command tone that cut through the noise of the storm and the dog's panicked movements. Then, in a lower voice that barely carried above the rain hammering on the workshop roof, she began to speak, not cheerful reassurances or empty platitudes, but the steady, matter-of-fact cadence of a mission briefing. Storms moving northwest to southeast. Typical spring system for this region, estimated duration 2 to 3 hours with peak intensity in the next 30 minutes. Location is secure. All entry points monitored. Perimeter established with robust barriers. No hostiles. In the vicinity, she continued in this vein, describing their location, the security measures in place, the predicted weather patterns. Factual information delivered in the calm, authoritative tone she had used during countless operational briefings. Gradually, she became aware that the frantic movement within the crate had subsided, replaced by what felt like attentive stillness. Morgan didn't change her approach, continuing the steady flow of tactical information as the storm raged around them. She wasn't trying to comfort Ranger as one might comfort a pet. She was providing what she herself had often needed in moments of crisis: clarity, structure, and the assurance that someone was in control of the situation. Eventually, the thunder began to move away, its booms becoming more distant and less frequent. Morgan's voice had grown hoarse, but she maintained the steady narrative until the storm had passed completely, leaving only the gentle patter of residual raindrops on the roof. In the new quiet, she became acutely aware of her physical discomfort: soaked clothing clinging to cold skin, injured leg throbbing mercilessly, back stiff from sitting on the hard floor for over an hour. With careful movements, she pushed herself to standing, using a nearby workbench for support when her leg threatened to buckle. "Transition complete for now, Ranger," she said, keeping her tone even despite her exhaustion. "We'll continue according to protocol." She proceeded with the original plan, setting up the transfer system between crate and kennel with methodical precision despite her trembling hands. When everything was ready, she opened the crate door and stepped back to the prescribed safe distance. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Morgan waited patiently, making no attempt to coax or command. Finally, slowly, Ranger emerged. First his scarred head, then his powerful body moving with deliberate caution. He paused at the threshold between crate and kennel, his single eye scanning every detail of his new surroundings before he committed to the transition. Once Ranger was fully inside the kennel, Morgan secured the door with the multiple locks Kelly had insisted upon. Only then did she allow herself a moment of relief. leaning against the wall as reaction set in. The entire episode had been a baptism by fire, a test of both her resolve and her instincts before they'd even properly begun this journey together. Forcing herself to complete the established protocol, Morgan set out fresh water and the special food Kelly had provided, placing both within reach through the specialized feeding hatch. She set up the baby monitor that would allow her to hear any distress from the cabin, adjusted the lighting to the recommended dim setting, and finally prepared to leave Ranger to settle for the night. At the workshop door, she paused to look back. Ranger had positioned himself in the far corner of the kennel, his body angled to maintain sightlines to both the door and windows. He wasn't relaxed. Morgan doubted he ever truly relaxed, but the frantic panic of earlier had subsided into the familiar vigilant readiness she recognized from her own sleepless nights. "Perimeter secure," she told him quietly. "I'll return at 600 hours." As she limped back to her cabin through the rain-fresh darkness, Morgan felt the weight of responsibility settling over her like a familiar rucksack. This wasn't going to be easy. In fact, it might prove to be one of the most challenging missions she'd ever undertaken. But for the first time since returning from Afghanistan, the difficulty ahead felt meaningful rather than merely punishing. Inside her cabin, Morgan forced herself through essential self-care before collapsing into bed, dry clothes, medication for her leg, a quick meal of warmed soup, and the promised call to Kelly, reporting their safe arrival and the storm incident. Her last conscious action was to place the baby monitor on her nightstand, its soft static a strangely comforting reminder that she was no longer completely alone in her mountain isolation. Sleep came swiftly, dragging her under with the force of physical and emotional exhaustion. For the first night in months, her dreams were not of explosions and fallen comrades, but of rain-washed forests and a one-eyed sentinel standing watch through the darkness. Morning arrived with the crystalline clarity that often follows mountain storms. Morgan woke at 5:30, her body protesting the previous day's exertions, but her mind unusually clear. She lay still for a moment, listening to the soft sounds coming through the baby monitor, the occasional shift of movement, a single, quiet huff that might have been a sigh. Ranger had made it through his first night, so had she. Rising with deliberate care to minimize the pain in her leg, Morgan began the day exactly as outlined in Kelly's manual, preparing Ranger's morning meal before tending to her own needs, measuring medications with pharmaceutical precision, gathering supplies for the first official day of their shared journey. Every action was purposeful, focused on establishing the consistent routine that Kelly had emphasized as essential for Ranger's sense of security. At precisely 6 a.m., Morgan entered the workshop, her movements measured and predictable. "Morning. Check, Ranger," she announced in the same even tone she'd used yesterday, giving him clear auditory notice of her presence. Ranger was already alert, standing at the front of his kennel with his head slightly lowered, not submissive, but watchful. His eye tracked her as she moved through the morning protocol, checking the security features, adjusting the temperature, and preparing to deliver his breakfast through the specialized feeding system that minimized direct contact. "Food delivery in 3 minutes, Morgan told him, measuring the special kibble mixture according to Kelly's precise instructions. She narrated each action in the same calm, informational tone she'd used during the storm, neither expecting response, nor trying to elicit one. When she placed the food in the delivery tray, however, Ranger made no move toward it, maintaining his position at the front of the kennel, his focus unwavering on Morgan rather than the meal. Kelly had prepared her for this possibility. "First 72 hours. Don't expect normal eating patterns," the manual stated clearly. "Leave food available for 20 minutes, then remove whether consumed or not. Do not coax or show concern. Maintain absolute consistency in schedule regardless of response." Morgan nodded to herself, setting the timer on her watch. "Food available until 0625. she told Ranger matter-of-factly. "I'll be conducting perimeter maintenance. We'll return for evening check at 1800 hours." As she turned to leave, she caught a subtle shift in Ranger's posture, a slight tilt of his head that seemed almost questioning. Morgan maintained protocol, making no attempt to engage beyond the established routine, but she filed away the observation for her daily log. Kelly had emphasized the importance of documenting every behavioral nuance, no matter how small it might seem. The next 2 days established a rhythm of careful coexistence. Morgan maintained the schedule with military precision. Morning checks, midday monitoring via the baby monitor while she worked on forestry reports at her cabin desk, evening routines that gradually extended to include 5 minutes of quiet presence in the workshop after completing the essential tasks. Ranger remained vigilant, but not aggressive, accepting food sporadically, but showing increasing interest in Morgan's movements and routines. On the morning of the 4th day, something changed. When Morgan entered the workshop for the morning check, Ranger was not in his usual alert position at the front of the kennel. Instead, he lay on the provided bed, his head raised but his body language noticeably less tense. As she moved through the familiar routine, narrating her actions as always, he watched with the same intensity but without the coiled readiness that had characterized their previous interactions. According to Kelly's transition plan, Day 4 marked the beginning of the next phase, introduction to the outdoor run that extended from the workshop into the fenced clearing. This step represented significant progress in their journey, a tangible marker of growing trust and stability. Outdoor access scheduled for 0900 hours, Morgan informed Ranger as she completed the morning feeding routine. Today, he had accepted the food immediately, another positive sign. "I'll return to facilitate transition." When Morgan re-entered the workshop at the appointed time, carrying the specialized long lead that Kelly had recommended for initial outdoor experiences, she found Ranger waiting attentively at the kennel door, his single eye fixed on the lead in her hands with unmistakable recognition. This was equipment he understood from his military training. Following Kelly's detailed protocol, Morgan attached the lead to the kennel door before opening it, creating a secure transfer system that would prevent any possibility of escape. "Transitioning to outdoor run," she narrated, maintaining the consistent communication pattern that seemed to help Ranger process changes in routine. The moment held weight beyond its practical significance. This was the first time Ranger would be outside of direct containment in Morgan's presence, a test of the tentative trust they had begun to establish through 4 days of careful coexistence. Ranger hesitated at the threshold, his body language conveying caution rather than fear. Morgan remained perfectly still, the lead held with just enough tension to establish connection without applying pressure. After several long moments of assessment, Ranger stepped deliberately through the opening, his movements smooth and controlled despite the obvious hypervigilance in his posture. The specialized harness Kelly had provided allowed Morgan to maintain safe control, while minimizing any sensation of restraint that might trigger Ranger's defensive responses. As they moved together toward the workshop's exterior door, Morgan was struck by the surreal normalcy of the moment. A woman and a dog walking side by side, connected by a lead. Yet underneath this ordinary image lay layers of trauma, military, training, and cautious adaptation that made their journey anything but typical. Outside, the spring morning offered a symphony of sensory information. Mountain air carrying traces of pine and melting snow, birds calling from the surrounding forest, sunlight warming the clearing where winter's final patches of white still lingered in shaded areas. Morgan watched as Ranger processed this sensory landscape, his nostrils flaring as he catalogued smells, ears swiveling to track sounds, eye scanning the perimeter with tactical precision. Kelly's instructions for this phase had been explicit. Allow exploration without direction. Maintain distance while ensuring security. Do not attempt training or engagement. This is observation and acclimation only. Morgan positioned herself at the prescribed distance, maintaining gentle contact through the lead while giving Ranger space to investigate the enclosed area at his own pace. His movement patterns told their own story, the cautious assessment of a trained military asset evaluating new territory, looking for threats and escape routes, with instincts honed through rigorous training and combat experience. After completing a systematic survey of the perimeter, Ranger paused near the center of the clearing, his attention suddenly fixed on something at the forest's edge beyond the fence. Morgan followed his gaze to spot a mule deer watching them from the tree line, its large ears swiveled forward in alert curiosity. For the first time in their brief acquaintance, Morgan saw Ranger's body language shift from defensive vigilance to professional focus, the posture of a working dog who had identified something requiring assessment. It wasn't playfulness or predatory interest, but the calm, concentrated awareness of an animal with a job to do. The moment passed quickly as the deer bounded away into the forest, but its significance lingered. Beneath the layers of trauma and defensive behavior, the working dog still existed, the military professional who had once utilized his extraordinary senses and training in service to his handler and unit. As they completed the scheduled 30-minute outdoor session and returned to the workshop, Morgan found herself contemplating the parallel with her own experience. How many people saw only her limp, her scars, her social awkwardness, missing the capable ranger and soldier still present beneath those visible markers of trauma? How often had she herself forgotten that those capabilities remained, buried, but not destroyed by what had happened in Afghanistan? In the careful routine of the days that followed, something shifted between Morgan and Ranger, not dramatic enough to be called bonding, but a mutual recognition that transcended their respective roles as human and dog. They were establishing something Kelly hadn't explicitly covered in her comprehensive manual, professional respect. Each morning now included the outdoor session, gradually extending in duration as Ranger's comfort level increased. Morgan began, incorporating simple perimeter walks along the fence line, maintaining the narration that seemed to help Ranger process their shared activities. She described the surrounding forest, the weather conditions, the seasonal changes becoming visible as spring fully established itself in the mountains, not attempting conversation, but creating a consistent auditory landscape that complemented their physical routine. On the seventh day, as they completed their morning perimeter check, Morgan detected a change in Ranger's alertness, a sudden tension in the lead, a shift in his body position from walking to standing, head raised and focused intently on the forest beyond the eastern fence line. Morgan stopped immediately, scanning the area for whatever had triggered Ranger's response. She saw nothing unusual among the lodgepole pines, but she had learned to trust Ranger's senses, which far exceeded her own. "Identifying potential contact," she said quietly, using a phrase from her military days. "Hold position." Ranger's posture intensified, his focus unwavering on a specific section of the forest. Morgan narrowed her eyes, straining to detect whatever had caught his attention. After several tense moments, she spotted movement. A black bear emerging from between the trees, its powerful form ambling toward the creek that ran about 50 yards beyond her property line. The bear showed no interest in them, likely unaware of their presence behind the fence. It was a common enough sight in these mountains, especially in spring as the animals emerged from hibernation. Under normal circumstances, Morgan would simply observe from a safe distance, appreciating the privilege of watching such a magnificent creature in its natural habitat. Ranger, however, was processing the bear through the lens of his military training. His body vibrated with tension, not fear, but readiness, the instinct to alert, to protect, to fulfill his purpose as a working dog designed to identify threats and safeguard his handler. Morgan faced a critical decision. Kelly's manual emphasized minimizing stress and avoiding triggering situations during this initial transition period. The responsible choice would be to immediately remove Ranger from the stimulus, returning to the safety of the workshop before his alertness escalated to aggression or panic. Yet something in Ranger's demeanor, the professional focus rather than irrational reactivity, made Morgan reconsider. This wasn't a trauma response, it was a working dog doing exactly what he had been trained to do. Denying that purpose might actually increase his stress rather than alleviate it. Making a judgment call that deviated from Kelly's protocol, Morgan dropped to one knee beside Ranger, bringing herself closer to his level while maintaining a secure hold on the lead. "Contact identified," she said in a clear, calm voice. "Black bear, approximately 150 meters, moving away from position. Not a threat. Good alert, Ranger. Well done." She kept her tone matter-of-fact, acknowledging his correct identification, while simultaneously providing contextual information that classified the bear as a non-threat. It was how she would have communicated with a human teammate during a patrol, professional recognition followed by situational assessment. For several tense moments, Ranger maintained his alert posture, seemingly processing this new information against his training and instincts. Then, with deliberate control, he shifted his weight, relaxing from full alert to watchful attention, without taking his eye off the retreating bear. Morgan felt something expand in her chest. Not exactly pride, but a deeper recognition. Ranger wasn't just a collection of trauma responses and defensive behaviors. He was still a capable military professional who could assess, respond, and adjust based on new information. His capacity hadn't been destroyed by his injuries and experiences. It had just been buried beneath layers of pain and survival instinct, much like her own. "Stand down," she said quietly, rising back to her full height. "Let's complete the perimeter." As they resumed their walk, maintaining a careful watch on the bear until it disappeared into the deeper forest, Morgan felt a subtle shift in their connection through the lead. Not the hyper-vigilant tension of their early interactions, but something more balanced, more mutually aware. They weren't handler and dog, not yet, perhaps not ever in the traditional sense, but they were becoming something equally meaningful, comrades recognizing capabilities and respecting boundaries. Two veterans finding a way to navigate the world after service had left them changed, but not diminished. That evening, as Morgan completed the final check before retiring to her cabin, she found Ranger watching her with a steadiness that felt different from his previous wary assessment. For the first time since his arrival, she addressed him directly, rather than simply narrating her actions. "We did good work today," she told him, her voice quiet in the dim workshop. "We'll continue tomorrow." It wasn't affection or sentimentality. Morgan wasn't capable of offering those yet, and Ranger wasn't ready to receive them. It was something more fundamental. Acknowledgement between professionals, respect earned rather than assigned by role. As she turned off the lights and secured the workshop door, Morgan realized she was looking forward to tomorrow's routine, not just enduring it or using it to structure empty days, but actively anticipating the continuation of something that had begun to feel meaningful. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was unmistakably purpose. A first fragile root taking hold in soil she had thought too damaged to nurture growth. Outside her cabin, the mountains stood sentinel against the darkening sky, ancient and uncompromising. In their beauty, somewhere in the distance, a wolf called to its pack, the sound echoing across the valley with wild determination. Inside the workshop, a one-eyed military dog settled into his nightly watchfulness, alert, but no longer alone. And between them, a woman who had once defined herself solely by what she had lost began to consider, however tentatively, what might still be possible. 2 weeks after Ranger's arrival, Kelly's scheduled visit loomed on the horizon. According to the transition plan, this first evaluation would determine whether Morgan could continue with the conditional adoption, or if Ranger would need to return to the shelter for reassessment. The prospect created a tension Morgan hadn't anticipated, a growing protective instinct toward the progress they had established, however modest it might appear to an outside observer. The morning began like any other, with Morgan maintaining the precise routine that had become the foundation of their developing trust. Ranger now accepted food without hesitation, completed the perimeter checks with increasing confidence, and had begun responding to basic positioning commands, not with the eager compliance of a pet, but with the professional acknowledgement of a working dog, recognizing competent leadership. As Morgan prepared the cabin for Kelly's visit, she found herself mentally cataloguing the small victories that might not register as significant progress to someone expecting traditional rehabilitation benchmarks. Ranger still maintained vigilant distance. He hadn't sought affection or displayed conventional signs of canine attachment. He remained hypervigilant around the workshop, startled at unexpected noises, and showed clear anxiety when Morgan deviated from established patterns. Yet beneath these persistent challenges, Morgan recognized the emergence of something essential. Ranger was adapting rather than merely enduring. He watched her not just for potential threats, but for information and direction. He had begun anticipating routine transitions, positioning himself at the kennel door before she announced the morning check, moving toward the workshop exit as outdoor time approached. These weren't dramatic transformations, but to Morgan, they represented critical shifts in his perception of their shared environment. The crunch of tires on gravel announced Kelly's arrival precisely at the scheduled time. Morgan watched from the cabin window as the shelter's van navigated the final curve of the forest road, its white surface gleaming in the late morning sunlight. She felt a flicker of nervousness, not for herself, but for Ranger. What if Kelly deemed their progress insufficient? What if the fragile foundation they had established was dismantled by a return to the shelter environment? Taking a deep breath to center herself, Morgan limped out to meet Kelly, consciously straightening her posture despite the persistent pain in her leg. Today's weather matched her mood, clear but cool, with a brisk wind that carried the scent of pine and the promise of another mountain storm building on the horizon. Kelly emerged from the van with a clipboard and a large bag that presumably contained evaluation tools and equipment. Her expression revealed nothing as she surveyed the property, taking in the security measures and environmental modifications Morgan had implemented. "Sergeant Reeves," she greeted with professional neutrality, "how have the first 2 weeks progressed?" Morgan led Kelly toward the cabin, matching her pace to the other woman's deliberate steps. "We've established a consistent routine. He's accepting food regularly, responding to basic positional commands, and completing the outdoor sessions without incident." She hesitated, then added, "He alerted on a black bear last week, maintained control when informed it wasn't a threat." Kelly's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her professional mask. "He distinguished between wildlife and threat. That's actually quite significant." She made a note on her clipboard. "Any aggressive incidents, attempts to escape containment, refusal of necessary handling." "No," Morgan replied, leading the way into the cabin, where she had prepared coffee and laid out her detailed logs of Ranger's daily routines, behaviors, and responses. "He's cautious but not aggressive, maintains distance but accepts necessary proximity during transitions." Kelly set her clipboard on the table and accepted the offered coffee with a nod of thanks. "That's encouraging, but I'll need to observe him directly. After reviewing your logs, we'll proceed with a structured evaluation including kennel behavior, response to handler proximity, and basic command compliance. For the next 30 minutes, Kelly examined Morgan's documentation with methodical thoroughness, occasionally asking for clarification about specific incidents or behavioral patterns. Her questions were precise and technical, focusing on physiological indicators of stress, sleep patterns, and responses to environmental stimuli rather than conventional measures of canine socialization. "Your logs are impressively detailed," Kelly commented finally, setting aside the notebook. "Military precision has its advantages in these situations." She took a final sip of coffee and set down her mug with decisive finality. "Let's see him." The short walk to the workshop seemed suddenly longer, Morgan acutely aware of Kelly's evaluating gaze, taking in the security measures, the specialized equipment, the attention to detail that reflected her commitment to Ranger's safety and progress. The knowledge that all of this could be deemed insufficient created a tightness in her chest that reminded her uncomfortably of pre-mission assessments. Inside the workshop, Ranger was already alert, standing at attention in his kennel, with his eye fixed on the door. The arrival of a vehicle, a disruption to the established routine, had clearly registered, and his posture conveyed controlled vigilance rather than panic. "Ranger status check," Morgan announced in her usual tone, using the phrase that had become part of their daily communication. "This is Kelly. She's a cleared visitor." Kelly remained by the door, observing the interaction with clinical attention. "Does he respond to verbal cues consistently?" she asked, making notes without taking her eyes off the dog. "To specific phrases within established patterns," Morgan clarified. "Context-dependent rather than command-driven at this point. He recognizes sequence cues more reliably than direct commands." Kelly nodded, her expression revealing nothing about whether this constituted acceptable progress. "I'd like to observe a standard transition to the outdoor area. Proceed exactly as you would normally, no adjustments for my presence." Morgan moved through the familiar routine, preparing the security lead, narrating each step, maintaining consistent positioning as she approached the kennel door. Ranger responded with the measured cooperation that had become their norm, moving deliberately from kennel to lead attachment with alert but controlled attention to Kelly's presence near the exit. Outside, the wind had intensified, carrying the scent of approaching rain. Ranger's nostrils flared as he processed this sensory information, his body language shifting subtly into the weather assessment posture Morgan had come to recognize over the past 2 weeks. "Storm front approaching from the northwest," Morgan told him, providing the contextual information that seemed to help him process environmental changes. "Estimated arrival in approximately 3 hours. We'll complete standard perimeter check and return to shelter before precipitation begins." Kelly watched this exchange with heightened interest, making rapid notes on her clipboard. "You communicate with him as you would with a human teammate," she observed. "Not simple commands or affectionate speech, but tactical information." Morgan hadn't considered it in those terms, but the assessment was accurate. "It's what seems to register with him," she explained, watching as Ranger began his systematic assessment of the perimeter, moving with the purposeful efficiency of a security professional rather than the random exploration of a pet dog. "He responds to information more reliably than to commands. I think it's consistent with his military training, context, and mission parameters rather than isolated directives." They completed the perimeter check with Ranger, demonstrating his now standard alertness without aggression, acknowledging Kelly's presence with cautious assessment, but no obvious stress response. When they returned to the workshop, Kelly requested, a demonstration of the feeding routine, the medication protocol, and finally, the evening security check that concluded their daily cycle. Throughout the evaluation, Morgan maintained her usual communication patterns with Ranger, neither emphasizing their progress for Kelly's benefit nor attempting to disguise ongoing challenges. This wasn't about passing a test. It was about honest assessment of their current reality and future potential. When the formal evaluation concluded, Kelly set her clipboard aside and faced Morgan directly. "I'd like to speak with you privately," she said, her tone giving nothing away about her conclusions. Back in the cabin, with rain now beginning to patter against the windows as the predicted storm arrived, Kelly finally revealed her professional assessment. "Ranger has made remarkable progress, given the severity of his initial presentation," she began, referencing notes from her clipboard. The behavioral markers I'm seeing indicate decreased hypervigilance, emerging trust within established patterns, and, most significantly, the re-emergence of working dog capabilities rather than purely defensive responses." Morgan felt a tightness in her chest ease slightly. "So the conditional adoption can continue?" "Yes, with adjusted protocols moving forward." Kelly pulled several documents from her bag. "Based on today's observations, I believe we can accelerate certain aspects of the integration process while maintaining appropriate safety measures." She spread the documents across the table, modified training schedules, new behavioral goals, and expanded environment parameters that would gradually increase Ranger's freedom and responsibilities, within carefully managed boundaries. "What you've established isn't conventional rehabilitation in the shelter sense," Kelly explained, her professional demeanor softening slightly as she outlined the new approach. "You're essentially reintegrating a veteran K9 officer into a modified service role. The structure you've created mirrors his military training rather than attempting to convert him into a companion animal." The assessment struck Morgan with unexpected force. She hadn't consciously approached Ranger's rehabilitation from this perspective, yet Kelly's observation crystallized something that had been forming in her subconscious throughout their first weeks together. "Is that, appropriate?" Morgan asked, uncertain whether this constituted success or failure according to the shelter's standards. "He's not certified as a service dog. I'm not a professional handler." Kelly's expression shifted into something more personal than professional for the first time since their acquaintance began. "Sergeant Reeves, there are no established protocols for cases like Ranger. Military working dogs with severe PTSD and physical disabilities don't fit neatly into our standard rehabilitation frameworks. What matters is whether he's showing improved welfare markers and decreased distress behaviors, which he unquestionably is under your management." She tapped the new protocol documents with decisive finality. "The next phase will focus on expanded environmental exposure and graduated responsibility. He needs purpose, not just safety. Your instinct to treat him as a capable professional rather than damaged goods was exactly right." As Kelly gathered her materials in preparation for departure, the rain intensified, drumming against the cabin roof with growing insistence. "I'll need to head back before the storm makes the forest roads impassable," she said, checking her watch. "Monthly evaluations will continue as scheduled, but you can contact me any time if you encounter challenges with the new protocols." "Deal." At the door, Kelly paused, looking back at Morgan with an expression that had shifted from clinical assessment to genuine recognition. "You know, when you first came to the shelter asking for the one nobody wants, I was certain this would end badly. Military veterans with PTSD adopting traumatized military dogs raises every red flag in our behavioral evaluation system." Morgan said nothing, waiting for Kelly to reach her point. "I was wrong," Kelly admitted simply. "You understood something about Ranger that our conventional approaches missed. He doesn't need to be fixed or transformed. He needs to be recognized for what he still is, not just what he's lost. She glanced toward the workshop where Ranger waited. That's true for both of you, I suspect. After Kelly's departure, Morgan returned to the workshop to find Ranger standing alert at the kennel door, his posture conveying what she now recognized as anticipation of their standard storm protocol. During the 3 weeks of their acquaintance, they had weathered 5 significant mountain storms, each one managed with increasing coordination and decreasing distress. Storm intensity increasing, Morgan informed him, securing the workshop door against the strengthening wind. Estimated duration 4 to 6 hours based on current weather patterns. We'll implement standard containment protocol with modified position. The modified position had evolved naturally during their second shared storm, when Morgan had discovered that Ranger's distress decreased significantly when he could maintain visual contact with both the main workshop door and her position. Now, instead of retreating to the cabin during severe weather, Morgan had established a small work area in the corner of the workshop where she could complete forestry reports or equipment maintenance while providing the steady presence that seemed to help Ranger process the triggering stimuli of thunder and wind. As the storm intensified, Morgan settled into her now familiar routine, spreading topographical maps across the workbench as she updated trail condition reports for the coming tourist season. The rhythmic task required just enough concentration to focus her mind without demanding the kind of attention that would make her unavailable to monitor Ranger's stress signals. Between thunderclaps, Morgan found herself contemplating Kelly's assessment and the implications of the modified protocols. The recognition that they were building something more akin to a working partnership than a traditional human-animal bond clarified aspects of their interaction that had previously seemed instinctual rather than strategic. What would this partnership look like as it evolved? Morgan's forestry work involved long days patrolling remote wilderness areas, monitoring environmental conditions, and occasionally assisting with search and rescue operations when hikers or climbers went missing in the vast national forest. Could Ranger eventually participate in these activities, finding renewed purpose as a working dog with modified responsibilities suitable to his capabilities? The possibility created an unexpected sense of anticipation, not just for Ranger's continued recovery, but for the potential expansion of Morgan's own reintegration into purposeful service. Since her medical discharge, she had approached her forestry work with competent detachment, fulfilling responsibilities without the sense of mission that had defined her military service. The prospect of a working partnership with Ranger offered something she hadn't realized she was missing: shared purpose. A particularly violent thunderclap shook the workshop, rattling the windows in their frames. Morgan glanced up immediately, assessing Ranger's response with the heightened awareness they had developed during previous storms. He was alert, but not panicking, his eye fixed on the southwestern corner of the ceiling where the sound had been. Most intense. Just thunder, Morgan confirmed, maintaining the matter-of-fact tone that seemed most effective in these situations. Storm center passing directly overhead. Maximum intensity should decrease within approximately 20 minutes. As if in direct challenge to this assessment, another thunderclap boomed overhead, this one accompanied by a distinctive crack that Morgan recognized instantly as lightning striking nearby. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the workshop into sudden grey dimness, broken only by the occasional flash of lightning through the windows. The power outage was an unplanned deviation from their established storm protocol. Morgan tensed, waiting to see how Ranger would respond to this new variable in an already stressful situation. His body language shifted immediately into high alert, muscles coiled with the potential for either defensive aggression or panic response. "Power outage confirmed," Morgan said calmly, keeping her voice steady and informational. Backup systems engaging automatically. Stand by for temporary illumination. She moved with deliberate care to retrieve the emergency lantern from its designated position near the workbench. Her actions slow and telegraphed to avoid triggering Ranger's defensive responses. The soft glow of the battery-powered light filled the workshop with shadows, creating an environment significantly different from their usual storm protocol. This was the kind of unpredictable situation that Kelly's manual had warned could trigger severe regression in Ranger's progress. Multiple stress factors, the storm, the power loss, the altered visual environment, combined to create precisely the kind of chaotic conditions that had previously sent him into dangerous panic responses. Morgan faced a critical decision point. The safest approach would be to return Ranger to his secure kennel until the storm passed and power was restored, minimizing variables and potential triggers. But instinct told her that retreat now might undermine the trust they had carefully established, suggesting that when conditions became challenging, security would be prioritized over partnership. Making a judgment call that deviated significantly from the established protocols, Morgan moved to sit on the floor near Ranger's position, close enough to establish shared experience of the situation, but maintaining sufficient distance to respect his space and safety boundaries. "Power outage expected to continue for duration of storm," she told him, keeping her voice calm and factual, despite the tension evident in his posture. "Security systems remain operational on battery backup. Perimeter integrity maintained. Current situation uncomfortable but not dangerous." Ranger's attention remained fixed on her, his body still coiled with potential energy, but not actively engaging in panic behaviors. The lantern cast strange shadows across his scarred face, highlighting the empty eye socket and the jagged patterns of healed wounds that mapped his history of violence and survival. In that moment of shared uncertainty, illuminated by emergency light while thunder shook the walls around them, Morgan recognized something profound in their developing connection. Their progress wasn't built on comfortable circumstances or controlled environments. Those were just the scaffolding. The true foundation was being constructed in moments like this, when protocols failed, when conditions deteriorated, when they had to rely on the tentative trust established through consistent presence, rather than perfect security. "We've weathered worse," Morgan said quietly, the words emerging not as tactical information, but as shared truth. Ranger's posture shifted slightly, not relaxing exactly, but recalibrating from high alert to focused assessment. He kept his eye on Morgan, seemingly processing her words against his own evaluation of the situation. After several tense moments, he settled into a compromise position, still vigilant, still prepared for threat response, but no longer on the edge of panic. For the next 3 hours, as the storm gradually moved eastward across the mountains and the workshop remained in lantern-illuminated dimness, Morgan maintained her position on the floor. She continued updating her forestry reports, occasionally narrating relevant information about the storm's progress or the estimated time until power restoration. Ranger remained in his alert but controlled state, his attention divided between the ongoing environmental threats and Morgan's steady presence. When the final rumbles of thunder had faded into distance and the rain gentled to a soft patter against the roof, Morgan rose slowly from her position, stretching muscles stiffened by hours on the hard floor. "Storm passing," she confirmed, checking her watch against the schedule. "Power company estimated restoration time 2200 hours. We'll complete modified evening protocol and transition to night security setup." As she moved through the adjusted routine, compensating for the continued power outage with practiced efficiency, Morgan found herself reflecting on Kelly's parting observation. The connection forming between her and Ranger wasn't based on conventional rehabilitation benchmarks, or traditional human-animal bonding. It was something forged in shared experience of adversity, mutual recognition of capability despite limitation, and growing trust in each other's competence under pressure. They weren't healing each other in the sentimental sense, often portrayed in stories about traumatized veterans and rescue animals. They were building something different, a partnership defined not by what they had lost, but by what they could still offer when their remaining strengths aligned with common purpose. That night, after securing the workshop and returning to her cabin, where the power had also yet to be restored, Morgan sat on her porch in the rain-washed darkness, listening to the dripping forests and the distant calls of night creatures reclaiming their territory after the storm. The mountains loomed as massive shadows against the clearing sky, stars beginning to emerge in patches between dispersing clouds. For the first time since her injury, Morgan found herself considering the future not as an endurance test, but as potential space for renewed meaning. The Forestry Service would begin its seasonal wildfire preparation next month. Search and rescue operations would increase as tourists returned to the mountains with variable levels of preparation and common sense. Her role in these operations had been limited by her physical limitations and her reluctance to engage beyond minimum requirements. But with Ranger, with a partner whose sensory capabilities far exceeded human capacity, whose training in detection and alert remained intact despite his injuries, the possibilities expanded in ways she hadn't allowed herself to consider. Morgan pulled her phone from her pocket, composed a brief text to Kelly. Storm, power outage, Ranger maintained control throughout deviation from protocol, partnership, model showing significant potential. Request information on working K9 certification options for retired military dogs. The message sent, disappearing into the digital ether that connected her remote cabin to the wider world. Morgan remained on the porch a while longer, watching as more stars emerged from behind the dissipating clouds. Against the dark canvas of the forest, a meteorite streaked briefly before vanishing. A moment of brilliant potential, there and gone, but witnessed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The power would eventually return. The routine would resume with its modified protocols and expanded parameters, and the gradual work of building trust through consistent presence would continue. There would be setbacks, moments when trauma reasserted itself for either or both of them. Recovery wasn't linear. Kelly had emphasized that fact repeatedly, but something had fundamentally shifted during today's crisis and evaluation. The story Morgan and Ranger were writing together wasn't about rescue or rehabilitation in conventional terms. It was about recognition, of capability despite limitation, of purpose despite loss, of partnership forged through parallel experiences, of survival when return to former wholeness wasn't possible. As Morgan finally rose to enter her dark cabin, navigating by memory and the beam of a small flashlight, she felt the unfamiliar weight of possibility settling alongside the familiar burden of her injuries. The emptiness that had driven her too. The shelter that first day hadn't been filled, not exactly. Instead, it had been repurposed, transformed from hollow absence into potential space where something new could gradually take shape. In the workshop nearby, a one-eyed military dog maintained his vigilant watch through the darkness, not because he couldn't rest, but because standing guard was what gave his existence meaning. In her cabin, a wounded ranger lay awake, planning patrol routes that might accommodate both her limitations and Ranger's capabilities, not because sleep eluded her, but because purpose had finally found her again. Between them, a partnership continued forming, not in dramatic moments of transformation, but in the steady accumulation of shared experiences weathered together rather than alone. The seasonal transition from spring to early summer brought new rhythms to the Montana wilderness. Longer days filled with sunlight, the emergence of wildflowers across mountain meadows, and increased activity throughout the national forest as both wildlife and humans embraced the warmer weather. For Morgan and Ranger, this natural shift coincided with their own evolving dynamic as they entered the second month of their conditional adoption. Kelly's modified protocols had opened new possibilities in their daily routine. The most significant change was the gradual extension of Ranger's secured territory to include supervised time in the cabin itself, first for brief, structured visits, then for increasingly longer periods as he demonstrated consistent behavioral stability. Morgan had prepared a designated space in the living room, positioning a specialized bed where Ranger could maintain clear sightlines to all entry points while remaining a respectful distance from high-traffic areas. The integration had proceeded with military precision, each step carefully documented in Morgan's meticulous logs. Ranger maintained his characteristic vigilance, but the quality of his alertness had shifted from defensive hypervigilance to professional assessment, the difference between a soldier expecting ambush and one conducting routine security. He, still startled at unexpected noises, and maintained cautious distance from potential threats, but the hair-trigger panic responses had noticeably decreased. Morgan's first official Forestry Service patrol with Ranger came 6 weeks after his arrival, following Kelly's formal approval of the modified working arrangement. The expedition was limited in scope, a 4-hour hike along established trails to check condition reports after recent heavy rainfall. But it represented a critical test of their developing partnership in a less controlled environment. The morning of the patrol dawned clear and cool, with thin wisps of fog clinging to the valleys below Morgan's mountain property. She rose early, moving through her preparation routine with focused efficiency while fighting against an unfamiliar sensation in her chest, something dangerously close to excitement. Ranger was already alert when she entered the workshop at E5:30, standing at attention, as if he sensed the significance of the day ahead. Morgan had laid out his equipment the previous evening: modified tactical vest with Forest Service identification, specialized boots to protect his paws on rocky terrain, and the secure lead system that would connect them while allowing appropriate working distance. First official patrol today, Morgan informed him, maintaining the informational tone that had become their standard communication pattern. 4-hour route assessment along eastern boundaries, minimal contact with civilians expected due to early departure time. As she helped Ranger into his equipment, she noted the change in his body language, a subtle but unmistakable shift from general alertness to professional engagement. The tactical vest seemed to trigger something in his muscle memory, his posture adjusting automatically into working position as Morgan secured the final straps. The drive to the trailhead took 30 minutes, Ranger secured in the specialized transport crate in the back of Morgan's Forest Service truck. She had selected the remote Eastern Trail system specifically to minimize potential interactions with other hikers or wildlife management teams, allowing them to focus on the operational aspects of their first official outing without social complications. When they arrived at the deserted parking area, Morgan completed a final equipment check before releasing Ranger from the transport crate. The early morning air carried the scent of pine and damp earth, the recent rains having left the forest. Floor soft and fragrant, wildlife activity was abundant. Birdsong filled the canopy above them, and fresh tracks in the mud indicated recent passage of deer and smaller forest creatures. Standard patrol formation, Morgan instructed, adjusting the specialized lead to working length. Primary objectives: trail condition assessment, hazard identification, boundary marker verification. They set out along the forest path, quickly establishing a rhythm that accommodated both Morgan's slight limp and Ranger's vigilant scanning patterns. The lead between them remained loose but present, a physical reminder of their connection rather than a restraint. Morgan noted with professional satisfaction how Ranger positioned himself, always slightly ahead and to her left, maintaining optimal position for both protection and communication. The first hour passed in efficient silence, broken only by Morgan's occasional observations about trail conditions or boundary marker placements, all documented in her handheld recorder for later inclusion in the official Forest Service report. Ranger maintained steady focus, his attention shifting between the trail ahead, the surrounding forest, and regular checks of Morgan's position. At a stream crossing where recent rains had partially washed out the small wooden bridge, Morgan paused to document the damage. As she photographed the erosion around the support posts and made notes about required repairs, Ranger's demeanor suddenly changed. His body tensing, head lifting to test the air currents, attention fixed on something beyond Morgan's sensory range. Morgan recognized the alert posture immediately, transitioning from administrative assessment to tactical awareness without hesitation. "Contact identified?" she asked quietly, scanning the surrounding forest for whatever had triggered. Ranger's response. Ranger maintained his alert position, his focus unwavering toward a dense thicket of undergrowth approximately 50 yards from their position. Morgan listened intently, filtering out the background sounds of the forest until she detected what Ranger had already identified, a faint rhythmic rustling, too consistent to be wind-driven, approaching their position from the east. Years of military training kicked in automatically as Morgan assessed potential scenarios. The most likely explanation was a hiker off the main trail, technically not permitted in this boundary area, but common enough during tourist season. Less likely, but still possible, wildlife management personnel conducting surveys, or possibly illegal hunters scoping new territory ahead of season. "Hold position," she instructed Ranger, her voice low but clear. "Maintain alert status." The rustling grew closer, accompanied now by the distinctive sound of human movement, branches pushed aside, occasional muttered words, the uneven cadence of someone navigating unfamiliar terrain without woodcraft skills. A moment later, the source emerged from the thicket. A man in his 60s, dressed in expensive but impractical hiking gear, clutching a high-end camera with a telephoto lens. Morgan relaxed slightly, though Ranger maintained his alert posture until she gave him the signal to stand down. "U.S. Forest Service," she called, her voice shifting into the official tone she used for civilian interactions. "This area is restricted access, sir. The public trail is approximately half a mile west of this position." The man startled visibly, nearly dropping his camera before regaining his composure. "Oh, I didn't realize—" He broke off, noticing Ranger for the first time. His expression shifted from surprise to unease, eyes fixing on the dog's tactical vest and scarred face. "Is that a police dog?" "Forest Service K9 unit," Morgan replied, the small deception justified by their official patrol status, despite Ranger's unofficial certification. "May I ask what brings you to this restricted area?" The photographer's attention remained fixed on Ranger, whose controlled alertness clearly made him nervous. "I'm tracking a red-tailed hawk nest," he explained, gesturing vaguely toward the forest canopy. "Rare opportunity to photograph fledglings just before first flight. Someone at the visitor center mentioned this eastern boundary had less human traffic." As the man spoke, Morgan observed Ranger's continuing assessment, alert but not aggressive, maintaining professional focus despite the stranger's obvious discomfort. This was their first direct civilian contact during an official patrol, a test of Ranger's stability in unexpected social interactions that hadn't been part of their carefully managed training scenarios. "The public trails offer excellent wildlife viewing opportunities," Morgan informed the photographer, her tone professionally neutral as she directed him away from the restricted area. "I'd be happy to mark appropriate observation points on your map before you continue." The interaction concluded without incident, the photographer departing toward the public trails with profuse apologies and a clear respect for both the uniform and the K9 officer who had intercepted him. When he was safely out of earshot, Morgan turned to Ranger with quiet approval. "Excellent work, maintaining professional alert without escalation," she told him, genuine respect evident beneath her matter-of-fact delivery. First civilian contact successfully navigated. Ranger's response was subtle but unmistakable, a slight relaxation of his posture, an attentive tilt to his head that acknowledged the assessment. Not the eager happiness of a pet receiving praise, but the professional satisfaction of a working dog who had successfully executed his responsibilities. They continued their patrol, completing the planned route assessment with methodical efficiency. When they returned to the truck 3 hours later, Morgan felt the unfamiliar weight of genuine accomplishment. Not just task completion, but meaningful. Service conducted with a partner whose capabilities complemented her own. The drive back to the cabin was quiet, but the quality of the silence had changed. No longer the tense absence of communication, but the comfortable quiet of teammates resting after successful mission execution. As Morgan navigated the winding mountain roads, she found herself contemplating the unexpected direction their partnership was taking. Not the basic rehabilitation scenario she had initially envisioned, but something with potential to expand both their capabilities despite their respective limitations. Upon returning home, Morgan completed the established post-patrol protocol, equipment removal and inspection, fresh water and appropriate nutrition for Ranger, systematic review of her notes and observations for the official Forest Service report. Throughout the process, she noticed Ranger watching her with the particular focus he displayed when processing new experiences, cataloging details, and apparently correlating them with established patterns. Initial patrol assessment. Successful, Morgan told him as she completed the final equipment check. Performance exceeded baseline expectations. Patrol schedule will expand according to approved progression timeline. That evening, as Morgan sat on her cabin porch reviewing the day's field notes, her satellite phone rang. A rare occurrence given her limited contact list and the general understanding among her few acquaintances that she preferred text communication to direct conversation. The screen displayed Kelly's name, unexpected at this hour. "Reeves," Morgan answered, military brevity still her default for phone interactions. "Morgan, it's Kelly," came the response, the behavioral specialist's voice, carrying an unusual note of urgency. "I'm calling about a situation that might interest you, given your progress with Ranger." Morgan straightened in her chair, instantly alert. "What kind of situation?" "Another military K9, just transferred to our shelter from Naval Base Kitsap in Washington," Kelly explained. "Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, handler killed in a training accident 3 months ago. He's exhibiting severe separation anxiety, resource guarding, and intermittent aggression. Classic PTSD indicators, but not as advanced as Ranger's case." Morgan processed this information with growing awareness of its implications. "Why are you calling me about this?" Kelly's hesitation was audible through the connection. "2 reasons. First, your approach with Ranger is showing remarkable success. The working partnership model, rather than conventional rehabilitation, has potential applications for similar cases." A deeper pause. "Second, there's a complication with this new K9. His handler was Specialist Teresa Navarro. Does that name mean anything to you?" The question landed like a physical blow. Morgan gripped the phone tighter, memories cascading through her consciousness with painful clarity. Teresa Navarro, the young combat medic who had been part of Morgan's final mission in Afghanistan, who had applied the tourniquets that saved Morgan's life and leg after the IED explosion. The same Teresa who had written Morgan letters during Her initial recovery, whose steadfast encouragement had been a lifeline during the darkest periods of physical rehabilitation. The same Teresa, whose funeral Morgan had been unable to attend 6 months ago, still too isolated in her mountain retreat to face the military community she had left behind. "Yes," Morgan managed finally, her voice tighter than intended. "I knew her." "I thought you might have," Kelly replied gently. "According to the transfer paperwork, her K9 partner, call sign Echo, is scheduled for euthanasia evaluation if suitable placement can't be identified within 2 weeks. Standard protocol for military working dogs with service disqualifying behavioral issues when handler succession fails." The implicit question hung in the silence between them. Morgan stared out at the darkening forest, mind racing through practical considerations. Her property could accommodate a second K9, but her experience with Ranger was barely 2 months old, hardly qualifying her as an expert rehabilitator. The potential emotional complications of working with Teresa's partner added another layer of complexity to an already challenging situation. "I'm not qualified," Morgan stated flatly, resistance rising automatically against the pressure of responsibility. "Neither was I when I started working with military K9s, Kelly countered, "but I recognize something in Ranger that others missed, just as you did. Sometimes qualification comes through understanding rather than certification." Morgan's gaze shifted to the workshop where Ranger was completing his evening routine, visible through the window as he made his systematic checks of the perimeter before settling into his night position. 2 months ago, that dog had been deemed unadoptable, dangerous, beyond rehabilitation. Now he was a functioning member of a working partnership, his capabilities honored rather than his limitations feared. "What would this involve exactly?" Morgan asked, decision not yet made, but resistance softening. "Initially, just an evaluation," Kelly assured her. "I can bring Echo to your property tomorrow. You assess the situation directly, then decide if you're willing to consider temporary fostering while we develop a more permanent solution. No commitment beyond initial evaluation without your explicit agreement." Morgan took a deep breath, weighing options with tactical precision. "Bring him tomorrow," she said finally. "I'll evaluate, but no promises beyond that." After ending the call, Morgan remained on the porch as true darkness settled over the mountains, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue of the evening sky. Tomorrow would bring a new variable into the carefully controlled environment she had established. Not just another traumatized military dog, but a living connection to Teresa Navarro and the life Morgan had left behind after her medical discharge. The prospect created a complex mixture of apprehension and something less familiar, a sense of potential purpose extending beyond her current parameters. If Echo could be rehabilitated using the same partnership model that was working with Ranger, it would validate their approach as methodology rather than coincidence. More importantly, it would honor Teresa's memory in a way that felt tangibly meaningful rather than merely symbolic. Morgan rose from her chair and made her way to the workshop for the final security check of the evening. Inside, Ranger acknowledged her presence with alert attention, but remained in his night-watch position, conveying both connection and self-sufficiency in his composed vigilance. "Schedule modification for tomorrow," Morgan informed him, maintaining their established communication pattern despite her internal turmoil. "Visitor arriving with potential second K9 for evaluation. Temporary disruption to standard routine." Ranger's ears twitched at this information, his single eye focusing more intently on her face as if assessing the implications of this unexpected development. Morgan found herself wondering how much he understood of the content versus the context of her words, whether he processed language literally or simply read the subtle cues in her body language and vocal patterns that even she wasn't fully conscious of conveying. "Maintain standard protocols," she continued, establishing clear expectations despite the coming disruption. Your position remains secure regardless of evaluation outcome. As she completed the final security checks and prepared to return to the cabin, Morgan noticed Ranger tracking her movements with unusual intensity, seemingly aware of her heightened tension despite her efforts to maintain normal presentation. This heightened perception was something she was still adjusting to, the reality that Ranger often detected her emotional state before she had fully acknowledged it herself, a mirror reflecting truths she preferred to ignore. Back in the cabin, Morgan found herself pulling out the small wooden box she kept on the highest shelf of her bedroom closet, the one container of military mementos she had allowed herself to keep after transitioning to civilian life. Inside, beneath challenge coins and her folded Ranger tab, lay a photograph taken in Afghanistan, Morgan standing with her unit, and beside them the medical team, including a smiling Teresa Navarro, her arm casually slung around the shoulders. Of a fellow medic, Teresa had been everything Morgan was not: naturally gregarious, quick to laugh, openly compassionate without sacrificing professional competence. She had treated Morgan's catastrophic injuries with both technical precision and genuine personal care, somehow knowing when to maintain professional distance and when to offer the human connection that kept Morgan anchored through the worst. Of the pain and disorientation, the thought of Teresa's canine partner facing euthanasia due to behaviors stemming from traumatic loss created a surge of emotion Morgan hadn't anticipated. Not just sympathy, but a sense of obligation that transcended rational assessment of her qualifications or capabilities. Teresa had saved her life with decisive action when circumstances offered no perfect solutions or ideal qualifications, only the necessity of immediate response to urgent need. Morning arrived with uncharacteristic cloud cover, muting the usual brilliant mountain sunrise to a gradual lightening of grey. Morgan had slept poorly, her dreams infiltrated by fragments of memory, the explosive impact of the IED, the searing pain of traumatic injury. Teresa's voice steady and clear amid the chaos, giving orders that translated directly into survival. She rose earlier than usual, channeling her restless energy into practical preparation. The second workshop bay, previously used for equipment storage, was quickly transformed into a potential housing area for Echo. Secure perimeter established, basic amenities prepared, sightlines arranged to allow visual contact without direct interaction during the initial assessment phase. When Ranger emerged from his night position for the morning check, Morgan noted his immediate awareness of the workshop modifications. His systematic inspection of the new arrangement conveyed professional assessment rather than anxiety, cataloging changes to his environment without necessarily judging them as threatening. Preparing for K9 evaluation, Morgan explained as she completed their morning routine. Temporary arrangements only at this stage, pending assessment outcomes. Ranger's response was characteristically measured, alert attention rather than obvious reaction, his single eye tracking her movements with the particular focus he displayed when processing novel situations. The absence of stress signals was encouraging, clear indication that their 2 months of consistent partnership had established sufficient trust to weather potential disruptions without triggering regression. Kelly's Forest Service van arrived, precisely at the scheduled time, navigating the winding forest road with familiar efficiency. Morgan watched from the cabin porch as it approached, noting the specialized K9 transport unit visible through the rear windows, similar to the one that had brought Ranger to this same property 8 weeks earlier. As the van came to a stop in the clearing, Morgan moved to meet it, conscious of maintaining a deliberate pace and neutral body language despite the tension coiling in her chest. Kelly emerged from the driver's side, clipboard in hand and expression carefully professional, the behavioral specialist rather than the almost friend who had shared coffee on her last visit. "Thanks for agreeing to this evaluation," Kelly said by way of greeting. "Echo has been sedated for transport. Minimal dose, just enough to manage anxiety during the journey. He should be fully alert within 30 minutes of arrival." Morgan nodded, acknowledging the information while glancing toward the transport unit, where she could make out the silhouette of a Belgian Malinois similar to Ranger in build, but with intact features. No missing eye or extensive scarring visible. From this distance, "I've prepared a secure assessment area," she informed Kelly, leading the way toward the modified workshop bay. "Sight lines established for initial observation without direct contact. Ranger is maintaining standard routine in the main workshop section with secure barriers between spaces." Kelly's expression registered approval of these preparations. "Excellent. We'll transfer Echo to the assessment area, allow him to acclimate to the new environment, then begin formal evaluation once the sedation has fully worn off." The process of transferring Echo from the transport unit to the prepared space proceeded with methodical care, both women moving with the practiced coordination of professionals accustomed to managing potentially volatile situations. Throughout the procedure, Morgan maintained emotional distance, focusing on the technical requirements rather than the personal connection to Teresa that Echo represented. Once Echo was secured in the assessment area, still groggy from sedation, but beginning to show signs of increased alertness, Kelly and Morgan retreated to the observation position Morgan had established at a safe distance. "His case file," Kelly said, handing over a thick folder similar to the one that had accompanied Ranger. "Complete service history, medical records, behavioral assessment from Naval Base Kitsap, and transport documentation. Initial handling recommendations are tabbed for immediate reference." Morgan accepted the file, scanning the first page with professional efficiency. The military ID photo showed Echo in his formal service position, alert, powerful, the embodiment of a working K9 in his prime. The contrast between that image and the disoriented dog currently pacing the assessment area with increasing agitation created a pang of recognition too personal to examine in Kelly's presence. "His behavioral presentation is still fluid," Kelly continued, watching Echo with clinical assessment in her gaze. "Not as severely affected as Ranger's case, but showing classic combat stress indicators exacerbated by handler loss." The military, handlers who attempted succession training, reported strong initial response followed by aggressive rejection. Typical pattern when grief complicates transition. Morgan continued reviewing the file, noting the medical details. No significant physical injuries, excellent baseline health, comprehensive vaccination status, alongside the behavioral observations that had ultimately led to Echo's disqualification from continued service. The formal language couldn't disguise the essential tragedy. A highly trained military professional, unraveled by grief, his specialized capabilities rendered inaccessible by trauma. "What's your professional assessment of rehabilitation potential?" Morgan asked, maintaining focus on practical considerations rather than emotional response. Kelly considered the question carefully before responding. "Higher than Ranger's initial evaluation, primarily because the behavioral deterioration timeline is shorter and there's no complicated physical trauma. However," she added with characteristic candor, "conventional rehabilitation approaches have already failed in the military setting where resources significantly exceed our shelter capabilities." The implication was clear. Echo's chances in the standard system were minimal. Like Ranger, he existed in the problematic space between service animal and pet, his specialized training and trauma response making him unsuitable for typical adoption, while his behavioral issues disqualified him from continued military service. As they observed Echo's gradual transition from sedation to full alertness, Morgan found her attention divided between professional assessment and personal response. The dog's movements, his alertness patterns, even the particular tilt of his head when processing new environmental information, all carried echoes of Teresa in ways Morgan couldn't rationally explain, but emotionally recognized. This was her partner, the canine extension of her medical practice, shaped by thousands of shared experiences that had forged a connection as real as any human relationship. "I'd like to review his file completely before making any decision," Morgan said finally, maintaining professional distance despite the growing certainty in her chest. "Can you leave him here for 24-hour observation? That would allow assessment of night behavior and initial adaptation patterns before determining next steps." Kelly nodded, relief evident beneath her professional demeanor. "That's reasonable. I brought sufficient supplies for 72 hours, including his current medication protocol and the specialized food he's been accepting most consistently." She hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think you're the best chance he has, not just because of your success with Ranger, but because of your connection to Specialist Navarro. Dogs recognize meaningful associations, even indirect ones." After Kelly's departure, Morgan spent the remainder of the day in methodical assessment, observing Echo's behavior from a distance, documenting his responses to the new environment, and reviewing his extensive service record with professional thoroughness. The facts presented a complex case: a highly trained military canine with exceptional service history, now compromised by traumatic loss, but with intact physical capabilities and relatively recent onset of behavioral issues. Between observation sessions, Morgan maintained Ranger's standard routine, carefully managing the introduction of another canine presence within their established territory. To her measured relief, Ranger displayed professional interest rather than territorial aggression, alert to Echo's presence but responding to the situation as a security development rather than a threat. As evening approached, Morgan faced the practical question of sleeping arrangements. The original plan had been to maintain complete separation during the 24-hour observation period, with Echo secured in the modified workshop bay while she and Ranger followed their usual night protocol. But as she observed Echo's increasing agitation as darkness fell, the pacing, the stress vocalizations, the clear anxiety about night isolation in an unfamiliar environment, Morgan reconsidered. Teresa had never left Echo alone overnight during deployments. This detail, mentioned briefly in the service records, suddenly seemed critically important. Like many combat teams, they had maintained constant proximity, Echo sleeping beside Teresa's cot in medical tents or field hospitals, always within sensory range of his handler, regardless of circumstances. Making a decision based on intuition, rather than protocol, Morgan modified the evening plan. With careful attention to security measures, she arranged her sleeping bag on the floor of the observation area, positioned where Echo could maintain visual contact without direct proximity. Ranger would remain in his standard night position in the main workshop area, separation barriers still in place, but with adjusted sight lines that allowed him to maintain visual awareness of Morgan's position. Modified night protocol, she informed both dogs as she completed the arrangements. Observation only, no direct engagement. Standard security measures remain in effect. That night, lying on the hard workshop floor with a traumatized military dog watching her from the corner of the assessment area, Morgan found herself contemplating the strange trajectory that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been existing rather than living, performing the minimum requirements of her Forest Service position while retreating from meaningful human connection. 2 months ago, she had impulsively adopted a one-eyed military dog deemed too damaged for rehabilitation. Now she was establishing a possible sanctuary for traumatized service animals, developing innovative rehabilitation protocols, and considering expansion of a program that had begun as simple companionship to fill the silence of her isolated existence. Most significantly, she was reconnecting with the part of herself that had been buried alongside her military career. The leader who faced difficult situations, not with the question, "Am I qualified?" but with the more essential determination, "What needs to be done, and how can I accomplish it with available resources?" Echo's gradual transition from anxious pacing to watchful rest as the night deepened felt like silent confirmation of this internal shift. By midnight, he had settled into a position that mirrored Ranger's professional vigilance in the adjacent space, not relaxed, not at ease, but functionally stable within clearly defined parameters. As Morgan drifted toward sleep, lulled by the soft sounds of the mountain night filtering through the workshop walls, she found herself remembering Teresa's voice during those critical moments after the IED explosion. Calm, authoritative, creating order amid chaos through sheer force of competent care. "You're going to be okay," she had told Morgan, while applying tourniquets and administering emergency medications. "Not the same as before, but okay in a new way. Keep breathing. Stay with me." In the quiet darkness of the workshop, with two traumatized military dogs maintaining watchful presence from their respective positions, Morgan silently acknowledged the truth that had been forming since Ranger's arrival. Teresa had been right. Not the same as before, but okay in a new way. Different capabilities, different parameters, different purpose, but fundamentally okay. The decision regarding Echo crystallized not as a dramatic revelation, but as simple recognition of already established fact. He would stay. They would develop protocols specific to his needs, building on the foundation established with Ranger. While honoring the distinct aspects of Echo's experience and capabilities, they would expand the partnership model, creating something that honored Teresa's memory not through passive remembrance, but through active continuation of the work that had defined her service. Morning arrived with characteristic mountain brilliance, sunlight streaming through the workshop windows in bright shafts that illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Morgan woke to find both dogs alert, watching her with the particular focus of working animals awaiting operational direction rather than pets seeking affection. "Beginning integration protocols," she announced, rising from her sleeping bag with the stiffness that came from a night on the hard floor compounded by her permanent injuries. "Ranger, maintain position. Echo, stand by for preliminary assessment." As she moved through the methodical process of establishing the day's modified routine, Morgan found herself recalling Kelly's words from their first meeting about Ranger. "Some creatures aren't meant to live in cages." The observation applied equally to the dogs in her care and to Morgan herself, all of them shaped by service, damaged by trauma, and unsuited to conventional expectations of recovery or purpose. What they were building here in the mountains wasn't rehabilitation in the traditional sense. It was adaptation, honoring capabilities that remained while acknowledging limitations that couldn't be overcome. It was partnership based on shared experience rather than hierarchical control. Most fundamentally, it was purpose rediscovered through mutual need and complementary strengths. When Morgan called Kelly later that morning to confirm her decision regarding Echo, she found herself articulating this understanding with unexpected clarity. "I'm keeping him," she stated simply. "Not just as a foster, but as a permanent placement. We're establishing something here that has potential beyond individual rehabilitation, a working model for military canines affected by service-related trauma." Kelly's response carried both professional approval and personal satisfaction. "I was hoping you'd say that. What you're developing has significant implications for how we approach these cases moving forward. The Shelter Board has expressed interest in formalizing your approach as a pilot program, with potential for expansion if outcomes continue to show positive results. The conversation continued with discussion of practical next steps: official paperwork for Echo's permanent placement, scheduling for Kelly's regular assessment visits, protocol development for the integration phase, and preliminary planning for the formal pilot program designation. Throughout the detailed planning, Morgan maintained her characteristic focus on operational parameters rather than emotional implications. Only after the call ended did she allow herself to acknowledge the deeper significance of the decision, not just for Echo and Ranger, but for herself. She was building more than a rehabilitation program for traumatized military dogs. She was creating a new form of service, one that honored her military background while accommodating her current limitations. She was establishing connections that extended beyond her isolated mountain existence, without requiring her to abandon the security and purpose she had found there. Most importantly, she was fulfilling a debt to Teresa Navarro that transcended conventional notions of obligation or gratitude. By providing Echo with purpose rather than mere shelter, she was honoring the medic's memory through continuation, of shared values rather than passive remembrance. As Morgan returned to the workshop to begin the formal integration protocols, she found Ranger and Echo maintaining their respective positions: alert, professional, damaged but not defined by their injuries. Their parallel postures, their watchful assessment, their controlled readiness, all reflected the military precision that had shaped their development and the trauma that had altered their trajectories. Beginning new operational parameters, Morgan informed them, her voice steady with the quiet certainty of purpose rediscovered. Integration Phase 1 commences now. Outside the workshop windows, the Montana wilderness stretched in all directions, mountains still bearing patches of snow on their highest peaks, forests dense with summer growth, valleys carved by ancient glaciers and mountain streams. The landscape itself seemed to reflect their shared experience, shaped by powerful forces beyond control, bearing scars that would never fully heal, yet remaining fundamentally whole in its altered form. Within this wild sanctuary, 3 veterans of different services but similar wounds had found each other, not through chance, but through recognition of parallel needs and complementary capabilities. Their shared journey was just beginning, its ultimate destination still undefined, but its direction unmistakably forward, toward purpose reclaimed through mutual support, limitations acknowledged without surrender to their defining power, and service reconfigured to honor what remained rather than mourn what was lost. Morgan moved between the 2 dogs, establishing the physical parameters that would guide their initial interactions. Her movements precise but not rigid, her expectations clear but not confining. This wasn't about control. It was about connection, about creating the conditions where healing became possible, not through elimination of damage, but through integration of experience into new forms of capability and purpose. "We begin here," she told them, her words simple but laden with significance that transcended their immediate application. Not where we were, not where we expected to be, but here, with what we have, moving forward together. The mountain light streamed through the windows, illuminating 3 scarred warriors as they embarked on the next phase of their unexpected journey, different from their original missions, altered by experiences that had nearly destroyed them, yet undeniably alive, with renewed purpose and the quiet dignity of service reclaimed on their own terms. The integration of Echo into the established routine progressed with methodical precision over the next 3 weeks. Morgan developed a comprehensive protocol that balanced individual needs with collective security, creating structured opportunities for the two dogs to acclimate to each other's presence while maintaining clear boundaries and expectations. The process required constant vigilance and adjustment. Echo's separation anxiety manifested differently than Ranger's trauma responses, necessitating specialized approaches to similar challenges. By mid-July, they had established a functional equilibrium. Echo had claimed the modified workshop bay as his territory, gradually decorating it with his distinctive behavioral markers, preferred resting positions, established surveillance routines, and the particular alertness patterns that defined his professional personality. Ranger maintained primary position in the main workshop area, but had adapted to Echo's presence with professional accommodation rather than territorial defensiveness. Their outdoor routines now included coordinated perimeter checks, with each dog assigned specific sectors corresponding to their particular capabilities. Ranger's missing eye had created a natural blind spot on his right side that Echo's intact vision complemented perfectly. Conversely, Echo's heightened sound sensitivity, both an asset in detection work and a vulnerability in stress responses, was balanced by Ranger's more selective auditory processing. Morgan documented these developing dynamics with scientific rigor, creating detailed logs that tracked behavioral indicators, stress responses, capability developments, and integration milestones. Kelly's weekly visits had evolved from formal evaluations to collaborative strategy sessions, with the behavioral specialist contributing professional expertise while acknowledging the unique insights Morgan's continuous observation provided. The pilot program designation is official, Kelly announced during her mid-July assessment visit, handing Morgan a formal letter bearing the shelter's letterhead alongside Forest Service and Veterans Affairs endorsements. The shelter board unanimously approved your rehabilitation approach as an authorized methodology for similar cases, with potential for expansion pending continued positive outcomes. Morgan accepted the document with characteristic restraint, acknowledging its significance with a nod rather than obvious excitement. "This formalizes the operational parameters we've already established," she observed, scanning the official language with focused attention. "But it also creates reporting, obligations, and exposure to external evaluation." Kelly smiled slightly, familiar now with Morgan's instinctive wariness of administrative entanglements. "It also provides resources and institutional protection," she countered. "The partnership with VA means qualified medical support for the dogs without complicated approval processes. The Forest Service endorsement legitimizes their working status despite non-standard certification. Most significantly," she added with deliberate casualness, "it establishes precedent for accepting other cases as they emerge. 3 military bases have already contacted the shelter about canines with similar profiles." This final point penetrated Morgan's professional reserve, triggering considerations beyond their current operational parameters. The pilot program designation transformed their isolated experiment into potential policy, a systemic approach to traumatize service animals, rather than exceptional accommodation for particular cases. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.